Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to all of you. I hope you are all safe and sound. My name is Oliver Hölke, and I'm working in the Public Relation Department of the EUKI, and I will guide you through today's Info Day event on the first call of proposal. Again, due to the pandemic, we have to carry out another important event as a digital event. That means no personal eye contact, no chit-chatting during the coffee break. But nevertheless, we are looking forward presenting you the EUKI guidelines and answering your questions about the call. Before we start, I would like to inform you that the event is being recorded. If you have an issue with the recording, you can drop out now and view the event later. The recording can be accessed under the current link for 7 days. After it, that will be available on our EUKI platforms. Now, during this event, we want to familiarize you with the goals and the fifth call for proposals by the EUKI. Thereby, we want to support you, and we want you to be well prepared for the selection procedure, hoping you develop high quality project ideas and avoid recurring pitfalls. Now I would like to share today's agenda with you. We expected Sarah Heft, Policy Officer at the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, in short BMU. And she will introduce to you the EUKI from a political perspective. Until now, we have technical problems, so it could be that her part will be cancelled. But after that, my colleague Benjamin Struss will provide you with information about financing, objectives, and priorities. In detail, he will deal with target groups, sectors, and countries, eligible activities, possible state aid implications. And then there will be a break of 10 minutes, maybe for yoga exercises. After the break, in the second half, my colleagues Lisa Berkenkoetter and Elke Shrestha from the EUKI Department of Finance Management will inform you about formal requirements like eligibility criteria, conditions of project financing, financial and administrative selection procedure, and do's and don'ts. And last but not least, Matthias Daun will give you detailed information about the selection procedure. So today we will host the German Ministry for the Environment. I mean, we are still waiting for Sarah Heft, but I hope she will join us today. We will provide an overview of the application process, and most importantly, we will allocate a good part of our time for your questions and remarks. So we want to make this event as interactive and helpful as possible. So please use the chat function to submit your questions. All questions to the speakers and to the EUKI team are helpful for us. At the end of each input, we will provide sufficient time for a Q&A session. So in order to make the process as efficient and as smooth as possible, please submit your questions ahead of time. You can even start now with your questions. Unfortunately, we might not answer all your questions on the spot, especially when they are very specific or concern an individual issue of your organization. We hold this event to keep you informed about general issues and ask for your understanding that we cannot discuss individual project ideas in this format. So I'm asking my colleagues, is Sarah with us? If not, I would like to hear something from you. So if she can do her part right now, I would suggest that we continue with the input from my colleague Benjamin. Okay. I'm sorry for that, but maybe later she will join us and give her input a little bit later. But now I would like to introduce you to Benjamin Struss. He is a senior consultant of EUKI and coordinator of our EUKI Academy. He will provide us with more detailed information on objectives and priorities of the call and eligibility criteria for projects from a technical perspective. Benjamin, the floor is yours, or shall we change to Sarah? Is Sarah there? If you can hear us, Sarah, the floor is yours. Okay. This is the new virtual tech. Okay. Then Benjamin, please start with your input.
Okay, then we change the plan. Thank you very much, Oliver, for the introduction, and a warm welcome also from my side. I will now, in the next 10 to 15 minutes, give you a brief overview of eligibility criteria for this call from a more technical perspective, because before we then later on hear more about financial and legal requirements. Let's start with the first slide, the target sectors. Right. As since for those of you who have already participated in previous EUKI calls, we have a pretty broad range of sectors, of mitigation sectors, which we are financing, starting from agriculture, soils and forests, over buildings, commerce, trade and services, energy, industry, mobility, private households, or waste. In contrast to, for example, Horizon 2020, we are not having specific calls for specific sectors, but we follow a rather more bottom-up approach, in inviting ideas with a significant mitigation potential, and from these sectors, or also from a combination of sectors. Because if you are, for example, targeting, let's say, cities and integrate mobility issues, building issues, but also energy issues, this is also most welcome. What we are not financing are adaptation projects. If you are considering to do this, this is not the right program to apply for, and we will need to reject those project ideas. Also eligible are educational activities, also financing issues, let's say more cross-cutting issues in that regard. Okay, let's come to the next slide. Target groups. Here we will need to distinguish, let's say, two different dimensions. When we are speaking about target groups in the project application form, we are meaning basically final beneficiaries. So those groups you would like to target with the activities in the project. These are, let's say, first and foremost, governments, be they on a regional, local, or national level, but it could also be civil societies, consumers, or enterprises, if permissible, under state aid rules. And I will speak about state aid rules a bit later on, because this is also an issue for us. Sometimes final beneficiaries are mixed up with the potential implementers. So these are basically those who are intending to put forward an application or a project idea under this call. So here eligible are NGOs, national, regional, or local governments, but also non-profit enterprises or academic and educational institutions. Important thing is you must be non-profit, and you need to be able to prove this with the necessary documentation, either from a tax office or other authorities. And sometimes we have an overlap, or that target groups are identical. So implementers, let's say, from a government level, are also the final beneficiaries, but usually there is a difference. And I think the most common projects, what we have is that NGOs are applying with an activity that in one or another way is targeting governments on the different levels. Let's come to the next slide. Technical capacities. I think this usually goes without saying. So you must, when you apply for a project, demonstrate that you have the technical know-how for project implementation. You will be requested to hand in project references from previous activities, or if you are entering into new fields of activity, which is possible, you will need to convincingly show us that how you are going to demonstrate or how you are going to mobilize this new expertise. Because sometimes we have brilliantly written proposals, but if we look at the track record of the institutions, we cannot really see how you are going to implement it. So if you're going to hire new staff, or if you have built up the capacity in a different way, I mean, this is possible, but in this case, please do make this clear in the proposal. Subcontracting, and this is a bit related, is permissible, though the new expertise should not be entirely, let's say, mobilized by subcontracting it to a new institution, but it should also be, let's say, built up in-house. You can subcontract, as I said, certain actions. Quite typical, let's say, is a specific study on a topic which requires a very detailed technical knowledge, though this should be then a limited proportion of the overall budget. But we have seen in the past that projects were requesting 60, 70, or even 80% of the budget for subcontracts, and this is not something we will support at the end. Let's come to the next slide. Eligible activities. This is also a pretty broad range. Let's start from the very top, which is probably also the most typical. What we see is developing capacities either on an individual level. That means we have training provided, but it could also be organizational development, or also capacity building on a societal level. If you're going to engage in training activities, it sometimes or quite often makes sense also to not only look at the people you're going to train, but also at the institutions from which they're coming from, and whether it would be sensible to also work on the structures where the people are then coming back into the institution, that they have, let's say, the framework also to apply their knowledge and really make a change. Creating networks is also a typical activity, let's say, either networks between similar NGOs, for example, in different regions, or cross-country, but it could also be networks with other institutions. Implementing policy, or support the implementation of policies, or of developing policies, of developing, let's say, promotional programs, of developing local policies. This is also something what we are inviting. Developing strategies. We had in the past quite a few projects in the field of just transition, which is also, let's say, related to the last item here on the list, fostering dialogue. So if you're starting a process with different stakeholders from state level, from civil society, but also with enterprises on developing strategies for a just transition of a region and phase out of coal. And this, for example, is something which is feasible. Conducting studies is something what quite often we are also seeing in the project, and but this should, let's say, not be an isolated activities, but always come in combination with other measures. So if you're going to, or intending to do a large-scale analysis of, let's say, energy saving potentials without using the data you have gathered in a political process or in a political dialogue, this would be then also out of the scope of EUKI. But studies should not be an end in itself, but only a means to initiate something within the duration of the project as such. or also disseminating results within the sphere of awareness raising and so on. This is also something we are financing under the EUKI. Let's go for the next slide. I think this is something we can do fairly quick. Available funding. So we have a pretty broad range of volumes we can make available for an individual project, ranging from 50,000 for rather small, or usually also shorter activities, up to 1 million. These 1 million projects are usually then being implemented in a partnership with, let's say, more than 2-3 partners. What we can we see also here on the last item. So we allow, or we specifically invite you to form partnerships with other projects. We have in the past also, in exceptional cases, financing, let's say, individual organizations, but since the aim of the EUKI is to foster dialogue and foster cooperation, forming a consortia usually makes sense in that regard. Though we are financing up to 5 partners, I mean, do keep in mind the larger your consortium will be, that you will face transaction costs, and it's not always better to cover as many countries or include as many partners as possible, but rather tailor it to your specific project idea. Duration is up to 28 months, need to be finalized latest by March 2023. And I think what many people will interest you is co-financing, which is mandatory. We don't have a fixed sum of co-financing, but we usually, or let's say, we look at the individual case, and we also expect different, let's say, levels of co-financing depending on where the institutions come from. So if you are, for example, a smaller NGO from an Eastern or Southeastern European country without a basic funding from, let's say, EU funds or from national funds, we usually, let's say, expect a percentage, let's say a single-digit percentage points for as co-financing. If you are, let's say, a university or a well-financed research institute from Western Europe, we expect a proportion which is also higher. There is also something in the FAQs on this issue which you might want to consult, but again, we won't give a fixed amount here, but definitely it will be mandatory to provide a co-financing, and I think my colleagues from our financial team will speak also about this later on. Then we will come to the next slide, regional coverage. Here you can see the list or the countries highlighted in green, which are those where we are currently or have been implementing projects. I think except for the Netherlands and Luxembourg, I think most of the countries or all of the EU countries have in one or another way participated in the EUKI finance project. Since last year, we are also allowing the participation of candidate countries from the Western Balkans and Turkey. But those can only be as a consortium partner, as an implementing partner, but implementers must have their legal office in one of the EU member states. And very important, though in principle all countries are eligible, we do have a focus on countries of Central, Eastern, Southern Europe, plus the Baltic Sea regions, and those proposals coming from that area are let's say, favorably evaluated or favorably considered, and you are invited when you're preparing an idea also to include partners from these countries. And then I will come to my last slide, which is some remarks on state aid. The EUKI program has not been notified to the Commission for a general, let's say, state aid exemption. But so we need to make sure that EUKI projects are not distorting competition in the EU internal market. And you might say that we are all NGOs, we are all non-profit, that does not really care us, which is unfortunately not quite the case, because the understanding of an undertaking or a company in the EU state aid regulation is pretty broad. So suppliers on the market can be any entity which is engaged in an economic activity independent of its legal status. So we will need to provide an assessment of whether your project is in any way distorting the market. For this, you will be first and foremost requested to provide an own analysis of the market context. So what's the supply and demand? Are these services you are going to produce in the project? Are these also produced by companies and by other economic actors, and is there a specific demand for this project, and also a let's say that this demand actually translates also into that these goods are purchased, and then we will need to make a final assessment. There is, for those of you who know these state aid regulations a bit better, there is a de minimis regulation which allows some exemptions, which we have applied in 1 or 2 cases, but then only for specific, let's say, components, but not on a larger scale, and this is also something we would like to avoid. With this, I come to the end of my input, yeah, back to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for your input. And I think now we can open this conversation to all our participants. And I'm very happy to see so many of you out there, and so many are participating with their questions. And Benjamin is, I think, delighted to answer your inspiring questions. Our first question: what is the meaning of adaptation, which is excluded from the call? Can you give practical examples? Thank you.
Well, I mean, distinction, let's say, on climate change mitigation is basically all the sectors where we would like to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. Adaptation is rather how you are intending to cope with the effects of climate change. Let's say, put it very much in general. Be it prevent floodings, be it how to cope with droughts, and so on. And these are activities which we are not going to finance, but we are focusing on sectors where there is a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. Should the project cover all the eligible activities of EUKI? For example, capacity building, networks, policies, and so on?
Well, I mean, that of course depends on the project, but it probably is not sensible to try as much as, let's say, to combine as many activities as possible, but really see what makes sense to be integrated. And I would rather encourage you not to cover everything, but be specific and see where you can make the biggest impact.
Okay. Next question. How can we find other partners who are also interested in the application? Is there a network where we can exchange with interested partners?
Well, we don't offer, let's say, a networking, let's say, a networking platform or a forum where you can find partners also from other countries. I mean, this depends, or this is up to the networks you have, and this is something you would need to use. I mean, you might also want to consult the list of projects which we have been financing in the past. Whether there are partners working in related fields which you might want to approach. But I mean, this is something we can take with us maybe for the future if there is a big demand for it. But as a secretariat, we unfortunately cannot support, let's say, different interested applicants combine to find together in a consortium, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I can answer as part of the public relation department of the EUKI. We are also hosting the website of the EUKI, and there you also can find lots of examples of projects, and maybe you can find partners there on our web page, which is www.euki.de. Another question: do bigger projects require a bigger partnership?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, it always depends on the activities which you are doing, and whether you. Sometimes it makes sense to focus on 1 or 2 countries, and also not necessarily have up to 5 or 6 or 5 partners. So the maximum. But if you, let's say, combining different activities, maybe work on different levels. There's can also be sensible projects proposed which are focusing on 1 or 2 countries only, or maybe 2 countries.
Okay, thank you. Could you please elaborate on the difference between implementing partners and financial beneficiaries?
Well, when we let's say financing a project, we are always signing a contract with the implementer, how we call it. So you could, in some other terminology, is also the lead partner. And the lead partner is then forwarding funds from the grant, which we are making available to their partners or implementing partners in the consortium. So if you have a partnership of, let's say, 3, 4, 5 countries, the way is that we have the direct contract only with the lead partner, and the lead partner is then signing agreements with the other partners to regulate the flow of funds. Though for the let's say at the second stage, when you're submitting the full proposal, you will also be required to prepare a budget for each and every partner in the consortium, lead partner plus implementers. Implementing partners.
Okay. And now I think a very interesting question. I think that might interest everybody. Will there be another EUKI call in 2021?
Well, we do hope so. I mean, this is always depending on the funds made available by the German Parliament and then by the Ministry of Environment. I mean, we are positive that the funding program will continue also in the years to come. But at the end, this is only something we are going to know end of next year when the federal budget will be approved.
Right. Okay. Let's cross our fingers. Next question. Can all implementers be from the same country? The dissemination will be also at international level.
And we had this in the past, that we have projects focusing on 1 country only. I mean, if this is let's say, a very convincing proposal, this is also something what we can do finance. It's not the typical project, I would say, but yeah, it is possible.
Okay. Could you please repeat the information on the possible project duration? Shall the projects end in March 2023 or March 2024? And between, very specific, between August 21st till March 23, 20 months, not 28.
True. I mean, so the maximum duration is 28 months. So first project might be contracted in the second half of next year. So that will be probably September, October next year. And from that on 28 months. So that would mean we are indeed in 24 and not in 23, right?
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is the analysis of the market context in relation to state and obligatory for all projects? If yes, at which stage is it required? How is it normally conducted? Can it be included in the project budget?
No, it must be, let's say, ex ante with the project proposal on the project idea you're going to hand in. You need to prepare, let's say, a preliminary analysis, and this is something which can be, let's say, usually. I mean, you are working in an environment, you know about, let's say, or more or less specifically. What you are intending to do in the project. For example, if you would like within your project conduct energy audits, for example, and would like to finance this from the project, this is in a service which is also offered by, let's say, energy auditors on a commercial scale. So there you have an understanding that on the market you are operating, that there are also other market participants, and that there is also probably a demand for this activity. And from that perspective, you should approach, let's say, your analysis. And this should not be, let's say, a 20-page assessment from a law firm, but that should be based on your understanding of the conditions you are working in. And there's also not enough space, let's say, for 20 pages, but probably I think 1,000 characters or 500 characters. And in that dimension, your project should be analyzing this. I mean, for, let's say, 95% of the project, this is usually not an issue. For others, we will then probably also from the Secretariat will need to conduct a more thorough analysis to see whether there is indeed a distortion. But for the start, yeah, on the analysis should be on that level.
Now I have a question regarding eligible activities. Does the project under EUKI need to be accepted by the national government in the partner country, like in the case of EUKI projects?
Well, there is probably this is maybe a question we can hand over to Sarah when she will then do her presentation after all. But yeah, but maybe to give some first ideas, there is before the start of the project, there a list of projects will also be shared with the other member state governments for information, and also whether there are some questions on the projects. But yeah, I think Zara might be able to elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah, you mentioned Zara, and she's with us. And now I have, unfortunately, there's no more time for more questions. I will ask you the last question. And after that, yeah, we will hear something from Sarah Heft from the BMU. So the last question for you, Benjamin, what if the target group are companies? Is there an issue with financial aid to companies?
Well, yeah, this is related to the state aid question. So if you are, it depends a bit on the structure of the project and how you are intending to target companies. If you single out individual companies and would like to forward them a grant or a specific services, you will probably have a state aid relevance in that regard. If the companies are selected in a, let's say, in a competitive procedure, or let's say basically subcontracting services, then you will need to ensure that the procurement process will be done in a way that this is in line with EU procurement rules and also state aid regulations. But yeah, probably this is the case. I mean, with companies, it's tricky. There we probably need to make a more in-depth analysis of the project. But in general, companies or business associations as intermediaries are also target groups, and we would indeed welcome also proposals in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers, Benjamin. Now I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Heft, Policy Officer from the Division EU Climate and Energy Policy. European Climate Initiative Carbon Markets at the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. She will provide a quick overview of the EUKI from a political perspective. Sarah, please take it away.
Thank you, Oliver. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we do.
I hope you can also see me. Is that also possible now? Or just the slides?
Just the slides.
Well, okay. We have to be grateful that it works at all. No, I really had some technical issue this morning, so thank you all for your patience. It seems that Microsoft Teams was a bit overwhelmed by the large interest in the EUKI Info Day, which is, of course, in itself great news, just not for myself because I couldn't enter the room. So I would also like to welcome everyone from my side on behalf of the German Ministry for the Environment. If you could move to the next slide, please. This call for project ideas really comes right in time, where we see great progress in EU climate policy. So I'm sure you're aware that to accelerate the transition towards climate neutrality, last Friday, the European heads of state agreed on a new climate target. So now we will strive for at least 55% greenhouse gas reduction compared to 1990, which is really a major step for EU climate action, but also for international climate policy, where we really see also encouraging announcements from elsewhere, such as China, Southern Korea, and I'm sure many more will follow. And I'm really excited to work also with you now in the coming year on the implementation of this new target. We are expecting legislative proposals for basically all climate and energy policy instruments, which will then in the next step trigger down to the national and also the local level. So this is, I think, a major opportunity also for developing great new EUKI projects in light of these new developments. And it's also embedded into a wider strategy. If you could move on to the next slide. Thank you. So it's not only about reducing greenhouse gases, but it's really about improving quality of life in Europe, reducing pollution, which is detrimental to our health. It's about improving our homes, just basically improving quality of life, but helping also companies to become world leaders in clean products and technologies. And at the same time, supporting a just and inclusive transition in regions which will face particular challenges. And I would like to encourage you to also think along these lines when you develop your project ideas. If you could move on to the next slide, please. I would also like to stress that our new climate ambition falls into a great window of opportunity when we think about the next EU budget and the Corona Recovery Fund, the Next Generation EU, because in the coming years, 30% of all EU financial means need to be spent on climate action. This equals about 550 billion euros. So really, this is lots of money which will be spent on climate action. And the key issue is, how do we now move from ideas into action? And how do we come from isolated investments into climate action to a more holistic approach for a transition towards climate neutrality? So this is not about exchanging one bus line to e-mobility or exchanging a coal boiler to another boiler in a building, but this is really about embedding these actions which we can now trigger into a greater transition and having the long-term perspective in mind. And I think this is really where EUKI can deliver a major benefit. If you could go to the next slide, please. So back in 2017, we created the EUKI because we gained very good experiences with bilateral projects, which were embedded more in our political strategic cooperation with other governments. And we realized that there are significant financial means for investments in Europe. There are the big European funds, but often there's a lack of support for the steps that need to be done beforehand to actually come to good and useful, effective investments. So this concerns awareness raising, education on climate change, and also education on possibilities to reach greenhouse gas emission reductions, the exchange of good practices, but possibly also exchange of approaches which have been done elsewhere and which have not been proven to be successful. So supporting networking between key actors and change agents, and together developing integrated strategies and measures on the pathway towards greenhouse gas neutrality is one or several key pillars for the EUKI. And of course, our aim is also for you to develop capacities and building a bridge for EU funding to make the bigger steps possible. Next slide, please. So we have structured the EUKI in several pillars, which concerns the financing. One very big building stone is the call for project ideas, because our impression was, well, we have an idea what could be helpful to accelerate climate action, but of course we don't know the specific context of your region or your country or your city. And this is really where the call for project ideas helps us to identify what is needed on the ground and where you see the major needs in your context to actually move climate action forward. And in a second pillar, we have a call for tenders. This is more where we agree with our political partners in other ministries on specific actions which we consider as useful. For example, we agreed with the Czech Republic that we want to exchange in more depth on climate change education in schools. So we ourselves tendered a project. But the large majority of projects are actually coming from the call for project ideas. And what we did not want to have is like a zoo of many, many different projects which work isolated next to each other. But our aim was really to create an EUKI community, and the EUKI Academy was introduced to disseminate results between projects, to support networking. So I think many of you who have already implemented EUKI projects know that there is a yearly EUKI conference where we bring everyone together to Berlin. Of course, this year, unfortunately, this was not possible due to COVID-19, but we hope that we will be able to do this soon. And there are also many digital formats where you can participate, network, share results and insights across EU countries, but also within countries, and also to further develop your capacities in your organizations within the EUKI Academy. So thank you. I think this was all from my side. I'm happy to answer questions. Maybe I can already answer the first question, which was handed over to me, or Oliver, should we collect a few more questions beforehand?
No, just go ahead. If you still have the question in mind, then we can go ahead and answer it.
Okay. Yeah, the question was if projects need to be approved. Well, the projects don't need to be approved, but what we really want to support with the EUKI is a fruitful cooperation within the European Union, also between member states. So it is a major benefit if you can already show that your project idea is embedded into the political strategy of your country. And if you can also prove to us the political support, because this will probably also increase the impact of your project idea. So if you can, it's always a good idea to hand in a letter of support for your project idea from political stakeholders that are relevant for your project impact. And what we also do from the side of the ministry is that we send short descriptions of all project ideas which we consider as the best ones in the call for project ideas to the implementing countries, so the other ministries for environment, and ask them if they are happy if we would support these projects. So far, we have never received any significant, actually, we have never received a negative response. So I think the EUKI is also highly appreciated by the ministries of environment of the EUKI partner countries, and we have received great feedback and very constructive input from their side. So I think you don't need to be afraid of this, but I think you should also be aware that, for example, we would not finance a campaign against another government, because this would not really be the constructive spirit that we want to see in the EUKI projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think that'll be for now. Let's have a short break. Now let's listen to what Lisa Berkenkoetter and Elke Shrestha will tell us about formal requirements.
Good morning from my side as well. My name is Lisa, and as Oliver already told you, we are going to give you more information about the formal requirements of your EUKI application. I will start to give you some information in regard to the first stage, and more precisely about the eligibility criteria and conditions of financing. And Elke will continue with information regarding the second stage of the application. Next slide, please. First of all, I will give you some information about the legal requirements and organizational capacities. So project partners must be legal entities. This means that individuals are not eligible for financing. Suitable evidence must be provided within the second stage of your application. Extract from the appropriate register would be, for example, required. Organization must be a non-profit entity according to their article of association or actual management. In case there's a commercial operation alongside a non-profit business, the implementer must prove that the project is being implemented exclusively in the non-profit part of the business. When it comes to organizational capacities, we are requiring for the project qualified staff, which has the technical, commercial, and legal expertise to implement international project, a suitable accounting system, especially for the separating of non-commercial and commercial activities, a competitive, transparent, and non-discriminatory tendering procedure in compliance with national provisions and international standards. And last but not least, suitable internal control system, which should be at least contain the following 4 criteria, such as principle of transparency, 4 eyes, functional separation, and minimum information. Thank you, Oliver, for going to the next slide. Another important information is that the average annual project financing should not exceed implementers' average annual revenue of the past 3 financial years. With respect to the criteria of exclusion, the organization will be excluded from financing if the organization is in process of an insolvency, liquidation, or suspended business activity, if there's a failure to pay taxes, levies, and or social security contribution, if there was or is a serious misconduct by representatives of the organization, and if the implementation of the project has already been started. Next slide, please. Now we are moving to the conditions of project financing. So expenditures eligible for financing, if they are necessary to implement the project, if they are incurred during the specific project duration, if they are reasonable in accordance with sound business principles, if they are identifiable and verifiable. This means that they need to be recorded in an accounting system and needs to be backed by supporting documents, for example, invoices, receipts, contracts, time sheets, and so on. Materials and small equipment used for climate action are eligible in only small applications. And please plan an adequate resource for participation in EUKI Academy events, for example, the annual EUKI conference, and for cooperation with other EUKI projects. Next slide, please. Continuing with the project finance condition, I will give you some more information about the co-financing and subcontracting. An appropriate contribution to the costs of the project out of own and or in form of third-party funds is expected. This is why own funds support the own interest in your project. Only those own or third-party funds which can be monetarily classified and for which evidence can be provided may be included in the budget during the second stage of your application. Subcontracting is possible, but shall be confined only to single activities and is limited only to a small proportion of the overall budget. This means that main tasks should be carried out by the implementer and the implementing partners itself. Competitive tendering is compulsory for contracts from €1,000 onwards. Next slide, please. Last but not least, I will talk a little bit more about the requirements in regard to the selection of implementing partners. So the implementer should select their implementing partners on base of certain criteria. The requirements are stipulated in the Article 5.3 of the contract. Sample contracts for German applicants and applicants outside of Germany are available on our website. The assessment documents need to be kept in the office as proof of the selection procedure and should be available for GIZ or third-party auditors upon request. And possible criteria for selection are if the implementers are available, have the available capacity for the project implementation, if they have sufficient experience in implementation of third-party funded project, if they have professional skills and qualification of their employees, if there is integrity of the organization, if the organization has its headquarters and operates in Europe, and previous cooperation with the organization. Now I will hand to my colleague Elke so that she can explain more about the second stage of the application.
Thank you, Lisa, and a very warm welcome also from my side. I'm briefly going to touch upon stage 2 of the application process. As already explained by my colleagues, in stage 1, you will need to submit a project outline. In stage 2, if you are a successful applicant, you will be invited to prepare a full project proposal. Part of the full project proposal are detailed legal and commercial documents of your organization, plus a full-fledged project budget. At last, I will also talk about do's and don'ts with regard to formal requirements. Next slide, please. Based upon your documents, we will carry out a legal and commercial eligibility check, which means that we are checking background information of your organization. You will be required to enter all necessary data under Section 2 of the project proposal template in English or German. In particular, we are interested in the following points: your type of accounting system to assess whether you have professional and transparent IT-based accounts. We would also like to see samples of audited revenue and financial statements of the last 3 years. Then we would need information about your internal control mechanisms. Further, we shall check whether you comply with laws, anti-corruption standards, and how you abide by safeguards and gender policies. We would also like to see the registration certificate and status of your organization as proof of your non-profit status. Of importance are also sample audit reports of external auditing bodies. And we also will look into your internal standards and procedures for tendering and awarding contracts for supplies and services. Next slide, please. Part of the full project proposal is a detailed budget or financing plan. The budget shall contain your planned expenditure for the entire project duration. We have different cost categories, and each category has its own requirements. Administration costs are allowed up to 11% of direct cost. Both implementers, we can also call them lead applicants, and implementing partners develop their own budgets. The budgets of the partners will be collated by the implementer. As a general rule, the largest share of the project budget shall be allocated to partner organizations outside of Germany. The budgets shall comprise of the following cost categories: external experts and consultants for services that will be awarded based upon rules for awarding contracts for supplies and services. Then you will, of course, have personal costs for your own staff. Transportation and travel costs are for travel to participate in networking events, workshops, and for travel to project partners. Training costs are for conducting training workshops and for fees incurred for participating in trainings. Procurement of goods concerns purchase of small equipment and materials for carrying out project activities. One more cost category is other cost and consumables, which, for example, is for minor expenditure for events, such as refreshments, stationery, translations, etc. Then we have administration costs, again, as explained before, a lump sum of up to 11% of the above-mentioned cost categories is allowed. The last cost category is forwarding of funds. This category is applicable only for the lead implementer, and it comprises the total budgets of the implementing partners. Next slide, please. Since we want you to submit a successful application, last but not least, some advice about do's and don'ts. The do's. We appreciate if you are aware of our eligibility criteria and conditions of financing. In your rough budget estimate during stage 1, the preparation of the project outline, please take into account only eligible cost, as listed before in chapter about the cost categories. You shall implement the majority of the activities with your own staff, and subcontracting is not a major part of the budget. And please submit all necessary documents, including translations. The don'ts. What you shall avoid is missing information and missing documents, no translation of documents in languages other than English and German. Please also avoid that most activities are planned to be carried out by subcontractors and not by your own staff. Avoid non-compliance with GIZ requirements for budget preparation. What also should not be the case is that a majority of funds is planned for implementers in Germany. At last, I wish you all success for your applications and thank you for listening. And with this, I hand over back to Oliver.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Elke, for your input. And now we will open the conversation to all of you. There are already some questions which you submitted in the chat, and Lisa and Elke will now answer them. So the first question is in the category eligibility criteria. Question to Lisa. The total volume can go above 1 million, right? While EUKI grant is kept to 1 million.
Yes,
can you answer that?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, this is exactly right. So EUKI can provide a grant up to 1 million euro, and with the own funds or third-party funds, you can have a total volume of your project above 1 million euro. Yes.
Okay, now a question, conditions to the category conditions of project financing. Also to you, Lisa, regarding passing on of funds to third parties, final recipients, section 1.9 in grant agreement, can the final recipients only be the implementing partners of the project, or does this also include additional subcontractors? Are the implementing partners of the project allowed to the passed on funds to purchase external services themselves?
So I think the question is a little bit difficult because I think there are some questions, more than one question in one. So I hopefully that I can answer it, or maybe if it's not going to answer it right, maybe you can write a specific question afterwards. So you can pass funds to your partners. They are stated as implementing partners in your project outline, as well as later on in the project proposal, and each implementing partner gets his own budget. And in this budget, in general, they can show also plan subcontracting. In general, as we have already described before, subcontracting should be only a small part of the overall budget, but in general, each implementing partner gets his own budget where they are including all the planned expenditures, inclusively as well external services.
Thank you. Now also from the category conditions of project financing, a question to Elke. Does the work of a contracted staff in a research entity count as own funding or in kind?
Yeah, it depends upon you. If the partner or implementing, the main implementer is a research entity, then you can count your own staff as part of the budget and put them as own staff in your budget, but you have to, in the end, invoice the cost and prove the cost based upon pay slips. And same is possible in case you decide that the own staff of the research entity is contribution or third-party funding. In that case, you also have to prove the cost of this personnel with pay slips later on.
Okay, thank
you.
So
it really depends on how you structure your project proposal and who is in a partner organization or who is the third-party funder.
Okay, and next question, this one goes to Lisa, also in the category conditions of project financing. Is the average annual project financing counted on the basis of the average annual revenue of the implementer only, or is it the average of all consortium that is taken into account?
Yeah, this is right. So the average annual project financing is only based on the implementer average revenue of the last 3 years, not included with the implementing partner, only the implementer.
Okay, next question to you. Regarding financial capacities of small organizations, which may have several years experience but have not managed big amounts of money before, is it possible for the organizations of a consortium to join their financial capacity?
I do not have a general answer to this because this is really specific and needs to be seen case by case. But in general, it can be possible because you have already worked several years and have experience that you can demonstrate. But the thing is that experience with implementation of third-party funded projects are also taken into account in our eligibility check of your of the implementer itself. So it would really be case-on-case study where we see, okay, because there are other aspects which will be part as well. So how's the financial strength of your project or of your organization in general, and how is the experience gained so far? And there are other aspects as well, which we are going to check during our eligibility check. So if you have further questions on this, you can write us as well an email. But I think for now, yeah, I could only answer it in this way, that it really depends, and I can't give you straight away an answer to this.
Okay, thank you. Another question to you, Lisa. Since the number of implementing partners is limited, is it possible for an implementing partner to have an internal agreement with other local stakeholders so they could also benefit from the funding for time spent and or travel costs?
Yeah, so in general, as I have already pointed out, we have the implementer and then we have implementing partner who are receiving their own budget where they can also include external services or other things. And we have also the possibility including for travel costs, for example, external guests or stakeholders which are going to participate in a certain meeting or a workshop or whatever. So there is possibility, but this really depends on what expenditures are planned. But for travel costs and participating in different kind of workshops, it's possible.
Okay, thank you. Another question, can the provision of small grants be part of an EUKI project, for example, provided by implementing partners to schools for strengthening capacity?
So in general, I think there is no differences between the kind of grant you are going to contribute as third-party funds. In general, we need a written confirmation of the third-party donor, and we normally receive as well the contracts or the grant agreements of this certain third-party fund to see if the requirements from the EUKI are done there and if they can contribute as well the amount. So it do not depends on if it's a really big grant or a small one. It depends if I think this will be maybe a little bit too specific as well. When you have detailed questions on this, you can write myself and my technical partners as well. Maybe we can give you another answer to this as well. But in general, you can include small and other grants as well as third-party funds.
Okay, now another question to you, Lisa. Is procurement of software, is it eligible?
This depends really as well on the project idea. So in general, for a small amount, as I have already pointed out, expenditures for items are eligible, but this really depends on the project. If you need a certain software to implement activities, or you need a website, or not, it really depends on the project idea, and this would be something what we need to figure out on the second stage of your project application in case you're passing the first phase.
Okay, now we come to the category financial and administrative selection procedure. That means the second stage. Elke, there's a question for you from the WWF, from Eva Boschikova. Is the average annual project financing counted on the basis of the average annual revenue of the implementer only, or is it the average of the all consortium that is taken into account?
It is the average annual project financing of the implementer only. We consider the implementing partners separately. So we will also look into average annual project financing of the implementing partners, but this will be done separately. So we are not looking at the figures of the consortium.
Okay. Another question to you, Elke. Are references needed from all implementing partners?
Yes, we do need references from all implementing partners. It's not quite clear what you mean with references. If you mean all these eligibility documents, then we look into the lead applicant in more detail, and into the documents of the implementing partners, we look only into certain documents. So if you want to have more information, we can answer this information in an email. But you can also check on our EUKI website. There is more extensive information on this question as well.
Okay. I guess that is everything. We have questions. Yes.
If we have one more question, because there I think is one of the first questions somebody asked. Maybe there's another question I think to Elke. I have.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I see.
Sorry.
Right.
We already asked this question, but maybe Elke can say some additional words. Well, the question is regarding passing on funds to third parties, final recipients. This is the section 1.9 in the grant agreement. Can the final recipients only be the implementing partners of the project, or does this also include additional subcontractors? Are the implementing partners of the project allowed to use the passed on funds to purchase external services themselves?
Regarding the first part of the question, can final recipients only be implementing partners, or does this include only also subcontractors? Final recipients are the implementing partners. Subcontractors are not implementing partners. But within your budget, you can, of course, outsource services for supplies or services to subcontractors, but subcontractors are then part of your budget in an extra budget category, and they are not implementing partners. Regarding the second part of the question, whether implementing partners are allowed to pass on funds to purchase external services, that is of course possible, and it also will be reflected in your budget under the category external services or external experts, first budget category.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa and Elke, for your answers. So as you already said, if there are specific questions, you can write us an email. We will provide the email address later on a slide, but I can say it's info@euki.de. You later see it in the chat also. And yeah, we're coming to Matthias Daun. Last but not least, he will give you detailed information about the selection procedure. So Matthias, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, last but not least, I'm going to talk about the selection procedure. And next slide, please. But before we go into the selection criteria, which I will present to you, first get an overview about the timeline of the fifth call. So it is open until the 19th of January in 21, obviously. And after you submitted your project ideas, the ideas will be evaluated. And this takes roughly until May, June 21. And all of you who will be invited for the second stage will receive an email with an invitation to submit a full proposal. And shortly after that, we also send our letters of refusal, also via email. This is a normal procedure. In June 21, usually you will receive your refusal letter. And for those of you who are refused, there's always indicated some possibility to receive feedback. This is done via a feedback call, but at this stage now I will not elaborate on this. So please, next slide. As you might have already understood, the EUKI procedure or selection procedure is a two-stage procedure. So now we are in the first stage, meaning you are preparing a project outline. And the second stage is the full project proposal for those of you who are invited. And just a few ideas about the first stage. All outlines must be prepared in English. I already saw some questions with regard to German. This is not possible. Secondly, all the outlines need to be submitted online via our online platform on euki.de/en for most of you. And if all documents are completely submitted, they are all handed in obviously by the deadline on the 19th. All of them will be evaluated, and the evaluation is always based on the selection criteria we also state in our information on financing. So everything I am going to explain now is also still available online. If you read the information on financing, you will then identify 5 different criteria I will later explain. And the second stage then usually will be a full check of the proposal, and you will also interact with the EUKI team obviously more in detail, but at this stage I'm not going to talk about the second stage. So please, next slide. Before we go into the selection criteria, just briefly, I would like to elaborate on the overarching selection objectives. Benjamin, during his presentation in the beginning, already touched on such elements. I mean, I still want to highlight that it is important that project and project outlines still keep in mind that those 3, let's say, topical pillars we would like to focus our projects on should be part of the project, but not all of them, but in parts it is necessary. So creating awareness and pooling knowledge is one key aspect. Obviously, there are various reasons why we would like awareness and pooling of knowledge to be incorporated. Some of them are that we see it as a precondition, obviously, to involve certain stakeholders in transitions to a climate neutral Europe, and awareness and knowledge obviously are drivers of change, so it is an important aspect. The next one would be establishing networks or working with networks that are already established, so increasing them, exchanging of good practices. So this is a key element, especially reflecting the idea that cooperation between European countries should be part of the project. We see it as a prerequisite for joint action in Europe. And the last aspect would be developing capacities, simply human organizational capacities, but in that sense, they would like to strengthen, for instance, certain institutions and deliver technical knowledge to specific stakeholder groups and so on. But I could elaborate on a few more aspects, but those are the overarching selection objectives we try to or would like to see reflected in the project outlines. Next slide, please. So just now you can see an overview of all selection criteria we do apply when looking into the project ideas. There's 5 categories. The first one is relevance. Second one, the quality of the project concept. The third one, synergies. Fourth one, sustainability. And the last one is efficiency. I will later talk about each of the categories in more detail, and we are always ranking each category according to our 3-step scale from A to C, A being the best one. And obviously now what follows, the selection criteria, we would like to give you an idea on how we are looking into the project ideas. Obviously there is always a lot depending on the context of the given project idea. Since we talk about qualitative aspects, it's not that easy obviously to rate everything in detail, but I just want to give you an idea what we specifically look into, what is important, so we can help you in the process of writing your project idea. Next slide, please. So the first one, like I said, is relevance. And when we talk about relevance, we first of all check if you are focusing on one or more of the EUKI targets we previously talked about when I talked about the overarching overarching objectives of the initiative, and we look if you apply what we expect when we compare it with our financing information for the given year. Another aspect would be to align the project outcome with your targeted countries, implementing countries, but also, depending on the context, take into account the EU goals and targets of the specific sector, for instance. So we just want to see if you can embed the project idea into the given situation of the country and the EU policies with regard to this topic. Then the next issue would be that we like already at this stage that you can ensure the interest at least of relevant stakeholders, meaning it is encouraged that you already submit letters of support, particularly if you have governmental institutions involved, but also from all other stakeholders of the project. It's not mandatory, it's not compulsory, but it is encouraged to do it at this stage, especially when the project outcome and outputs depend on those stakeholders. If they are involved in certain activities, for instance, so we would like to see that those activities can be ensured. And with regard to relevance, also rather generic idea, but we would like also that you think about new approaches when it comes to climate protection. Maybe think outside the known patterns. What we mean by this, I mean, obviously you can have, or you have access to the database of projects we already fund. So we do not want to repeat what has already been done. More, we would like you to build on what has been done. Also, maybe think about some new ways to conduct mitigation actions and so on and so forth. But it doesn't exclusively say that only new and outside the box ideas are eligible or will be considered, but this is just a hint that it is well taken. The second criterion is the quality of the project concept. So it is rather an important criterion if you compare all 5 of them. First of all, simply we would encourage to present a plausible and coherent target system. At this stage, we apply 3 different levels or 4 different levels. So the impact, outcome, and output are usually written down by you. I will give you an example later. And also the types of activities you intend to conduct roughly. So at this stage, we would encourage you to, first of all, structure it in a good way so that it is clearly visible what your overall goal is, which is usually the outcome at this stage. The impact is rather the long-term goal, but what you directly affect by your project is at the outcome, the final goal, and outputs. And the outputs in our case, just to give you an example, are usually sub-goals which in the end contribute to the overall outcome of the project. An output itself is not to be confused with an activity. So just briefly, a workshop, for instance, would not be considered an outcome, but rather what the workshop caters for. So if you try to train professionals in a certain institution, your output formulation would rather be to support stakeholders in sector XY, for instance, and the means to do so are activities you are stating then below that you do workshops, conferences, whatever comes to mind and is senseful. So we look into that you have a good structure, demonstrate obviously also the use of good methods, can already show us that the interaction of planned activities is well thought through in order to achieve outputs and the final outcome. And if possible, is not at this stage mandatory to already have a time frame given, but if you can already state it to some extent, meaning what comes first, second, and third, for instance, it's not about April, March, or June. At this stage, this is also helpful. Next slide, please. The next one would be synergies. At this stage, obviously, you only have a few lines to state what kind of synergies come to mind with regard to your project ideas. So it is important for us that you demonstrate briefly that you have a good understanding of the project landscape with regard to the topics you are going to talk about or you are addressing in your project, and show also by referencing certain projects that you intend to work with them or even build upon their already achieved results. This is very important to us. It is rather better to mention 2 or 3 projects that you really directly might already identify as potential synergies, rather than simply stating that you intend to talk to Horizon Europe projects, but we don't really see if you actually identified already a project to work with or to build upon. So those would be synergies. The next one is the sustainability. When it comes to the sustainability, we would like to see that you at least think about how outputs and also products in that sense that you come up with in your project are anchored, first of all, in the specific region or country or municipality. There's different levels, no problem. It doesn't always have to be the national level. Show the potential that it can be further used or even used in different contexts, and also ensure in that sense that it is still accessible, for instance, via websites and so on. Or you might even already indicate to think about follow-up financing, thinking about forming further consortia, for instance, to carry on the topic at another level. Such issues can be brought up here and indicated in the given space. Obviously, nothing can't be elaborated in detail at this stage. We know that. So rather have 1 or 2 good ideas in mind instead of writing a holistic approach, which is not concrete enough. That would be it with regard to the sustainability. And the last one is efficiency. When it comes to efficiency, at this stage for us, we would like to see that the financial resources demanded in that sense appear plausible with regard to the stated activities. So we look at the activities, or we will always recommend you to quantify activities you plan. If you only write about workshops and conferences, obviously it's difficult to grasp the amount of workshops you intend to do. So it's easy for us to rank the efficiency if you quantify a certain aspect of your planned activities, and also keep in mind that we have a look at the respective partner countries or implementing countries with regard to price levels and so on and so forth. But details with regard to the budget are obviously only expected at the second stage when it comes to the full proposal. So next slide, please. Just to, in a way, repeat what I already said, some do's and don'ts at this stage. So it is important to have a good structure with regard to the target system, have it clearly indicated, even use numbering in that sense, so that you can clearly, for instance, allocate activities you stated with regard to the respective output. So it's easy to follow through what you are arguing for. Use the correct levels. This is what I meant, for instance, by output and activities. Formulate outputs as a goal, as a sub-goal, and then show activities 1 level below. Mention concrete synergies. Like I said, it's better to have in mind 1 or 2 or 3 projects you can work with, or organization. It always depends, obviously, not simply projects, but just don't be too generic, so that we don't really can evaluate if you actually know the landscape or not, or have something in mind you can work with. I already said quantify activities, especially when it comes to the efficiency evaluation, would be really helpful, and show ideas for the sustainable use of your outputs, products. This is referring to the sustainability aspect of the project. It is becoming more and more important that the outcome and outputs and also the results in that sense of a project can be used in the future as well, and are well thought through in that sense. And when we come to downs, obviously it is always the opposite side of what I said you should do. So do not mix up the levels of the target system, or at least try not to, and don't be too general and abstract. that actually accounts for a lot of the chapters. So that would be it from my side in general about selection criteria. I think we can do the Q&A now if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthias. And of course, there are questions for you. The first one is about COVID-19. How is COVID-19 affecting EUKI proposals?
Yes. So at this stage, obviously, with regard to COVID-19, there is no hard selection criteria. So there's no need to already have a perfect plan in mind what you would do in case COVID-19 affects even your project at the end of 2021 starting. So, but what is always good to have in mind, obviously, is the opportunity to at least transform some of the activities maybe in a virtual format. So if your project is heavily relying on physical meetings, that could be something in the end. We don't know the situation in 21 at the end of 21, but keep that in mind. But usually at the second stage, it would be a bit more relevant, because then we would like you also to submit a risk assessment in case we still see it as a relevant issue. But at this stage, submit your project idea, and it will not exclude your project. We always know that we have to keep it in mind, but it's no hard criterion at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Now there are a couple of questions regarding to two-stage selection procedure. The first question, do partners need to be absolutely confirmed at concept stage, or could additional partners be added at full proposal stage?
Usually it should be quite clear, because at this stage we would really like to see that the partners are involved. This is heavily related also to the issue of support letters when it comes to implementing partners, not stakeholders affected by the project. There's a little bit different issue, but there is always room to confirm an implementing partner at a later stage. But it should not be the case that the entire project is still completely unsure, or if the actual implementation is really not happening, because it still depends on the confirmation of 4 implementing partners, something like that. So if everything is set up and one of them still needs to send in some sort of support you're not sure with, this can also be all sorted out at the second stage, but it should be, or it is encouraged to have it already quite clear at this stage.
Okay, there's a further questions regarding the letters of support. Is it compulsory to submit letters of support at the first stage?
It is not compulsory, but it is heavily encouraged, I would say, because just reflecting on the past years and past calls of EUKI, more and more projects are really well prepared, handing in support letters. So at this stage, it's really nice to see that you have your partners and stakeholders which are relevant for the project already in place. If 1 or 2 or 3 of the support letters still will be handed in at the later stage, no problem, not compulsory, but it is encouraged, and we would recommend you to hand in as many as you can get, but do not obviously ask randomly everyone to hand in a support letter. You can also hand in, let's say, too many, but yeah, for the most relevant stakeholders, it is recommended.
Okay, thank you. There's another question concerning the project preparation stage. Will there be an information session for the project preparation stage?
If you are selected for the second stage, usually we have a project workshop for those who are selected. Yeah, last year it has been online as well, I think. This year, sorry, but for the next year we don't know yet. The year before we invited all selected implementers to Berlin for a 2 or 3 day workshop, and then we give more detailed advice on the full proposal and so on. Yeah, so there is support for the second stage, not for the further preparation of the project idea at this stage.
Okay. There's a question coming from a project which are currently at the initial stage of a project financed through EUKI. I would like to know whether it is possible to apply for another EUKI project while having another active project with EUKI, also with the same implementing partners.
Yeah, you can always apply. There's no problem.
So if you already have a
yeah, if you're in an EUKI project at the moment, you can still apply for another EUKI project. Obviously, we know who is in EUKI at the moment, and we look at what you are suggesting, if it makes sense, or if you simply replicate something you already did or something. But in general, there's no hurdle to invite as many, submit as many ideas as you like.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question, what percentage of the proposals accepted during the first stage are funded during the second stage?
Yeah. There is no guarantee that your project, when you are selected up in the first stage, will be funded. But usually those who are invited to submit a full proposal are the ones who will also be financed in the end. So there's a really high approval rate, but there's no guarantee. There can be exceptional cases, for instance, when we go into the more detailed financial analysis and evaluation. But in general, the chances are really high that you will be funded completely.
Okay, you already answered the question about compulsory to, if it's compulsory to submit letters of support. Now comes the question, the letters of support should be submitted by implementing partners?
It's definitely for the second stage important that they are on board. It is still not mandatory that they hand in support letters at this stage, but it is, like I said, encouraged to do so. And if we, this also relates to the very first question, I guess. Yeah, it is recommended.
Okay. Now a question about a project which already submitted and was refused. Now, we would like to have a direct feedback line to seek guidance concerning a proposal already submitted and refused in the fourth call. Possibly early as time is of essence for the present call.
Yeah, like I said before, if you are refused during the first stage and you have been, for instance, during our last call, usually you get an email saying, unfortunately, we cannot invite you to the second stage, but you can reply to this email and then you will be addressed to the respective evaluator, who then organizes a feedback call with you and goes through the criteria I just mentioned and gives you some examples of what you can do better for the next call. So we always encourage you, once you receive the refusal, to directly get in touch with us. Most of you do that then in June, July. And but obviously, if you still have questions and you still would like to know what went wrong, you can always send an email to info@euki.de and ask us, given the reference number of the project outline, and then we can have a brief call and give you some feedback if it is still relevant for this fifth call now for you. This is always possible, but recommended to do it after you get the refusal letter.
Okay, I think we're coming to the end. I guess we don't have more questions, or are there any other specific questions or general questions for Matthias? I mean, there's a question where can we ask more detailed questions? You just answered it. I mean, we are always you're always welcome with your questions, which you can direct to info@euki.de. But as I think, yeah, we're coming to the end. Thank you very much, Matthias, and of course, thank you very much, Sarah Heft from the BMU, and thank you, Elke and Lisa, for answering all these inspiring questions. And of course, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, again for the great participation and for sharing your questions and comments with us. All questions that have not been sufficiently addressed throughout this event might be answered by the funding information, the EUKI guidelines, which you can find on the EUKI website. And on our website, there you can also find the FAQs for the 5th call for project ideas. And these FAQs will be updated frequently. Of course, here we already mentioned that there are lots of questions which we couldn't answer during the session. But if you look at the FAQs, you might find an answer there. Also, never hesitate to contact our team, the EUKI team, via email, and we will put the email address and the link to the EUKI website in the chat. And now we wish you good luck, and of course we are looking forward to receive high-quality project ideas from you. And thank you all again for joining today. Don't forget to spread the news about EUKI and the 5th call for proposals. Have a great day. I wish you all a reflective Christmas season. Goodbye.